well,
Right, but it was
deal with
but
this.
the scene is it was sort of seen as a
I guess,
not what
okay,
you wanted to
now I
have.
understand now. Yeah, so it's something that you're forced to deal with that you would prefer not to have to deal with.
All right, so
Okay, I understand.
we'll hit the red button, I guess. Make sure it's going.
I'll try to come up with a decent
Anyway.
answer. No, it's a good question.
But are we rolling? Yeah. All right, so why don't we start with how you know what this project meant to you personally?
Sure.
And how you got involved in it.
Sure. So the way I became involved with the project was actually very near here, suddenly out of the blue after many years of not being in touch. Anna Sternschutz, emailed me to say, meet me on campus, and we got together for coffee. And I remember being very early stage pregnant, and I was sitting there, sick to my stomach, and she started telling me about this project. And as she engaged me more and more, I felt the effects of the pregnancy less and less, and I became completely engaged and enthralled. Of course, she said that the timing for taping and performances would be 3 days, I think, after my due date. And that was a little bit of a complicating factor. But I found the story so compelling and so personally relevant that it was really hard for me to say no. I didn't want to say no, despite the fact that the timing couldn't be worse for me. And the reason that it was so close is because of my grandparents, who all four of them went through the war. My grandmothers both evacuated, and they fled east. Both my grandfathers went to the front. One was managing one of the most important rail transportation lines of the war, getting supplies to and from the front, and soldiers and things like that. That was an extremely stressful job that was very, very difficult on him emotionally, and physically and mentally. And my other grandfather was a little bit younger. He was conscripted, I think, the day on his graduation date. He was, 17 and sent to the front to be a medic, and was sewing people's limbs together with some rubbing alcohol and string. And, and they spent the rest of their lives living in the Soviet Union, making sense of the war, making sense of their role in the history of the victory, because at the end of the day, it was difficult to be a Jew in Soviet Russia. And I don't even say Jewish, which is the appropriate word we should use. They were Jews in the most sort of, judgmental, difficult sense of the word. And it was in their passport. And sure, they received there's a picture of me and my grandfather where he's covered in medals. And the other one is also covered in medals, and they display them very proudly. But at the end of the day, you were still a Jew. It was in your passport. You were told where to live. You were told what job you could do. Both my grandfathers were quite successful at the end of the day. They were hardworking, and they, bowed their heads and worked hard and got far. But there was still something hovering over them for the rest of their lives in Russia. That Jew thing, where they had to be the best, and they had to, if somebody needed to drink, they needed to drink more. If somebody needed to work, they needed to work harder to make up for that, inherent defect in them, the Jew thing. So.
Now, one of the songs, a lot of the songs speak to, I find in Girl how it speaks to the experiences of so many Russian Jews, but specifically to your family. One of the songs, Kazakhstan,
yes,
really describes this refugee process. Can you talk about that song, both about the song itself and what it means to you and your family's experience in Kazakhstan.
Yeah. So I talked a little bit about my grandfather's, but my grandmother's story is one of evacuation, and one of them fled with her sister and her mom. Her father disappeared. He went to war and never came back. But the two girls and the woman got on a train that took them. They didn't know where they were going, and God, I'm an immigrant, and I immigrated here to Israel, and then here with my parents. At least my parents knew. They had a lot of uncertainty, but at least they knew. Oh, I shouldn't wave. Let's back up. So I'm an immigrant myself, and I immigrated twice, first to Israel, then to Canada, and there was a lot of uncertainty in the whole situation. My parents didn't know how they would work, where they would work, even where they would settle in Israel, but they knew they were going to Israel. My grandmother and her sister and their mother had no idea where they were going to end up, what conditions were going to be there. So they ended up taking a succession of trains and somehow ended up in Kazakhstan. And they lived in essentially like a straw hut. And it was a very, it feels completely surreal to be talking about this, because I still speak to my grandmother. She's in Moscow. We talk on Skype. I'm going to visit soon. And she talks about it with such optimism and positivity. You know, she's so incredibly strong, as is my grandfather. You know, if it were me, I don't know. I don't know how they did this. I don't know where they found the courage. Maybe the prospect of imminent death does something to people where they find that inner strength. But she was a little girl, but she was the older sister, so she was helping her mom, and she was doing the chores and the housework and the cooking. And also she took all of her school books with her so that she could keep up with her studies. And then when they came back to the Ukraine, she finished school. You know, wrote all her exams and excelled. But the one interesting thing that she describes about Kazakhstan is the friendliness of the locals. You know, something about those former Soviet republics during the war, whether they were predominantly Muslim or predominantly Christian, they seem to have put all of that aside. I mean, it wasn't really an issue. When the Jews arrived, they helped, because whether it was the Soviet thing that made everybody feel like one people, or maybe it was the war effort again and the danger of imminent death, and that one giant, horrible common enemy that brought people together, or maybe, crazy to think about it, just an inner sense of human goodness, which we forget actually does exist in the world, that caused the locals to be helpful to the Jews that fled. And my grandmother, who remembers a lot, it's kind of crazy, she's going to be 90 this year, doesn't really have any terrible stories of being sort of mistreated or being made to feel bad or lesser than while they were out in the evacuation.
Now, a couple of the songs you sing also sort of reflect this experience of being in the rear but still helping or during the whole war. One of the songs I'm thinking about is called Tybel's Breed, where a wife writes a letter to her husband at the front. Can you sort of picture your family in that when you sing that song, in the stories?
Sure. There's so again, my great-grandmother's husband, who was quite a prominent Ukrainian communist, went to the front and was never seen again. You know, Stalin used the war to purge, especially the Ukrainian communists, it seemed, and something he did or said just didn't agree with the boss, and so the war was a bit of a way to make people disappear. But listen, I don't know whether they wrote letters, but because where would they mail them, for God's sake? You know, it was such a chaotic, insane time that is difficult for us to kind of even think about in our time of ultra connectedness, right? Where if I can't get an answer from somebody within 15 minutes, I assume the worst has happened. So to be a wife and a mother, home with 2 girls, with a man who left and with a husband who left, and she doesn't know what happened to him. That emotional process, I would assume that they would start mourning them as soon as they're gone, even the ones that came back. But you literally, your life goes from this decent, predictable thing to an empty bed, and it's like your husband fell into a deep, dark hole, and you have no idea what his daily struggles are, you have no idea what he's doing, whether you'll ever see him again, and then you have to manage the emotions of your children, and then you have to evacuate. So what the women had to go through was so incredibly horrendous. And unfortunately, the other side of my family, my mom's parents, again, my grandmother evacuated and my grandfather was part of the war effort, but everybody who stayed, almost everyone perished. So you had 2 ways out. You could go to the front and fight for your life, or you could evacuate. But the people who stayed, whether or not they wrote letters, most of them didn't end up well. And it's the tragedy of this, the horrible, unspeakable tragedy of this war. And many of my family members ended up in Babi Yar, which was, you know, the mass grave, and various other smaller mass graves that don't get as much attention. It was. Now, what can you say about that time, honestly?
I mean, it must be something to read a song like the song you're singing, Tulchin, you know, written by, I think that was written by, was that, you know, a young, I think, teenager, I have to check the note, but who was a victim in Pechora, that, you know, countless people that, you don't know their individual stories, you don't know what happened, but then here we have the story of a person who saw their town destroyed, who saw all of these unspeakable horrors. Mm-hmm. From, you know, I guess it's a 2-part question. One, about the, you know, the personal historical background, but 2, as an artist, what's it like to sing something so, you know, it's very rare to sing something but that's a personal and so horrific with that kind of detail.
Let me drink and answer. This is a very good question because as a jazz singer, I'm used to singing emotional material, but it's very, very nuanced and personal, and it's about matters of love and feeling, but very subtle feeling. The songs that Anna presented me were, they were graphic, they were hard, they were with language and descriptions that I would never, ever be able to sing in any other project. And frankly, I actually told her that I couldn't sing about mothers losing children because I'm a young mom and I'm a mom, and I can't. I draw the line at that. But so many of the other songs, including Tulchin, were very, very difficult for me to tackle. But I had that sort of, at least historical emotional ability to relate, because I could put myself, at least intellectually, in the position, in the shoes of my grandfather's family. You know, 8 out of 11 perished, and their town was destroyed. And so to put myself in those shoes, to try to imagine, but frankly, you can't possibly imagine. You know, 2017, 2016, Toronto middle-class Jews, we can't possibly imagine what it was like for those people. Which is why projects like this are important. You know, they force us out of our comfort. They make us think about what our ancestors might have gone through. And hopefully they actually make us think about Jews don't go through this anymore. Who goes through this are Syrians and Eritreans and Somalis and groups that are, you know, who's, let me try that again. Groups for whom what we were singing about on that project, that's their reality now in 2017.
2018.
It's true. It is 2018. Let me say that again. Groups for whom, no, people for whom in 2018, the reality that we're singing about, the World War II reality, that's their reality now, which is horrific. Because we feel like we are not barbaric, we are civilized, we have cell phones, we have internet, and social media will lead to the democratization of the world. Really, you know? So I think a project like this is very important both in the context of bringing the past to us and making us understand our own heritage as Jews, but it's also interesting because so many kids in this world and so many women in this world still suffer the way the Jews suffered then. You know, so, you know, it serves a dual purpose. It makes us more aware of ourselves as Ashkenazi Jews in our history, but it should also take us out of our tribal experience and make us think about other people who are going through this now.
So we got one or two more little questions
Sure.
about songs that sort of probably would have fit better earlier, but they'll be edited back. Chuvasher Tekter, the song about women working in the rear to help the war effort. Do you know what you know, you mentioned that your grandmothers went to Kazakhstan. Do you know what they did at that time, and how does that song speak to you and their experience?
I think that song, Chuvasher Meidlich, was very interesting because it described, you know, it captured a different feeling, a different aspect of the war, where it was young women and young men who maybe didn't understand the imminence of the danger and didn't understand the scope of the danger and the sort of mass annihilation that was happening and would have happened even on a greater scale had the Soviets not won the war. For them, it was this time when they were engaged and mobilized and they were helping the men and helping the war effort, and it was kind of fun. They were together and they were working the fields and picking the berries and you know, there is something about, again, like a common enemy that brings people together and awakens them and builds a very quick community. And the song is written from a kind of an innocent standpoint where we're going to help and we're going to save and we're going to conquer Hitler. I think if these girls had were a little bit older, or maybe had kids, or maybe had an understanding of who this Hitler is and who the Stalin is, and the powers at play, and how many people were dying as they were writing these songs, maybe the tone would have been less sort of light. But at the same time, it's interesting because you know, there were children involved in the war and teenagers involved in the war, and you know, younger people who couldn't quite process the magnitude of it all. So they were going and they were contributing and they were helping without that incredible darkness that maybe their parents were feeling and experiencing. So it's interesting. You know, I found so many aspects of this project, the variety of the material, the variety of tones, the variety of voices, the variety of viewpoints, the different rhythms and different tempos that communicate different moods, I found that to be very, very interesting because it's not all like incredibly dark about mothers losing their children or children losing their parents. It has elements of patriotism. It has elements of like clearly these people have been brainwashed very well by the Stalinist machine, which is also a very important part of the story. And as much as we love to hate Stalin, if the people were less brainwashed and less sort of physically, forcefully corralled and to fight this monster, I don't know whether the war would have been won. So I don't know what I'm saying. I think I'm trying to make a point, but.
I think we have. Is
Do you have
there anything else
enough?
you wanted to ask?
No, that's very good.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Good.
Thanks.
Very good.
Thanks. There is that, when they're keep talking about this fucking subway in Toronto, sometimes I think, man, used to be a dictator, who could
Are
just.
you talking about the subway?
Yes, do you know what I mean?
TTC,
The
yeah.
TTC. It's just this
All the
idea.
people.
Stalin, who was a monster, but he mobilized and created a war machine in Russia in how many years?
Well, I would argue that, a lot of dictators, they make a point by building gigantic, by organizing gigantic construction sites.
Listen, I
But
agree
I
with
don't
you.
think like it's Stalin, because I think it's just in general, when you're not democratic, you can actually forget about the liberties and just, treat people as.
Yes, you can accomplish things,
Yeah.
Right.
to
You don't need building permits.
And you don't care
You don't
about whether it's, if it costs millions of
But
lives. Or
but let me ask you this: could have war been won? Could that war been won if the Soviet Union had a Chamberlain?
Like,
No,
history
no,
is
no.
Might not be started, right?
There would not have been Hitler without Stalin. No.
Because, for example, Stalin, he kind of, collaborated with Hitler in 1930 something.
Yes, I mean he did, and
And they kind of played, in favor of each other.
And they chopped Poland.
it's true.
Yes,
It's true. But what caused Hitler to rise was not Stalin. It had nothing to do. It has to do with the First World War and the reparations Germany had to pay. So, one way or another, Hitler came up, and I guess they needed a Soviet Hitler to stop him.
We don't know.
Do you have a minute to do one more
The
question?
history is like this. Like, you never know what would have happened if this would have happened.
I don't know.
No, but I know for sure that people who went to war, actually, we know that the war was only for 5 years, right? But they didn't know when it's going to be ending.
Yeah.
So they just went to the war and, okay, it might be for a month, for 2 years, maybe like, but nobody thought that.
No, of course. No, of course nobody
And
knew.
for Stalin, by the way, it was kind of.
Oh,
I
and
think
then
he
he.
was like in a big depression after the war began, because he was like, he couldn't believe for like a week that nobody could find him a party to make a decision. Like, he left the country for 1 week without like any sort of leadership.
He probably left all of his clones.
So we have one. You sort of touched on it, but we didn't get to Yagidus.
Mm-hmm.
But you sort of touched on it. About
Yeah, I
the
mean,
bit.
to me,
Right.
the two are the same song, essentially, just with different melodies.
Right. Well, the one thing about, maybe you can talk about Yagidus, what is interesting is you don't imagine in the midst of this horrific violence, right, and someone being sent off to war and evacuating in far off lands and total chaos, that young people are still falling in love.
Mm-hmm.
And the song has a lot of little bit of eroticism in it about this young couple and some of the symbols, and it is not the first image that comes to mind when you think of songs during World War II. You think, well, people are still young and falling in love and all that's still going on.
Yes, that Yagidus is an interesting song in the way.
If you could take away, yeah, perfect, yes.
Sorry.
Yagidus.
Better. Yagidus is an interesting song because it does just like some of the other songs that are on the record that show life during war and life continuing despite this horrible thing that everybody was experiencing. And sure, I mean, the boys will be boys and girls will be girls, and passion blooms out of the most strange, awful places and times. And I'm wondering whether it was even more so because people were living in barracks and people were living in tight conditions, and people maybe had, they didn't know how long the world, literally, sorry, I misspoke, but it's true. They didn't know how long the war would last, how long they would live, how long the world as they know it would exist. And maybe it made them a little less guarded of their emotions. Maybe they just allowed them to flow a little bit more freely because there was so much uncertainty. So again, we're left to guess. Well, I'm left to guess. People like Anna are left to study this and try to really fill our blanks. But as an artist, again, I found it very, very interesting to sing about the different aspects and feelings and experiences of that time. And I think the album really captures it well, both from the voice of children. We have a kid singing on there, and all the way up to the oldest and wisest and most, the people who really understood what was happening and understood that there was no time for romance and there was no time for child play. And so from the most optimistic and most patriotic and most emotionally unaffected to the most pessimistic and the most wizened. And I think the album captures all of that in a really interesting, beautiful way.
Perfect.
Cool?
All right.
All right.